The wind was the first to see her. It came racing over the canyon, sharp and dry, carrying the smell of sun-baked stone and distant pine. It howled against the cliffside as if trying to warn someone or something that the land itself was holding its breath. High above the valley floor, where even the eagles thought twice before gliding too close, a giant horse stood at the edge of a jagged rock shelf. Its dark mane snapped in the wind like a torn flag, and its shadow stretched long across the stone. Below that same ledge, a young native woman hung upside down over open air. Her ankle was caught in a twisted coil of rope snagged between two jutting rocks. Her long black hair swayed freely, brushing the empty sky beneath her. Far below, the canyon dropped into a dizzying sweep of stone and scrub. One slip, one shift of weight, and the earth would claim her without mercy. She did not scream. Her hands reached for the rock face, fingers scraping against rough stone, searching for something steady to hold. Dust fell from beneath her touch and drifted into the blue distance. The wind pulled at her clothing and tugged at her as if testing her strength. But still she held on, breathing slow, steady, fighting the rising panic in her chest. Above her, the giant horse lowered its head. It was no ordinary animal. Its build was powerful, thick with muscle earned from wild miles and steep climbs. Its coat carried the silver-gray shade of storm clouds before rain, and its eyes were dark and watchful. It did not shy from the cliff's edge, it did not tremble. It stood there with an awareness that felt almost human. The woman had been gathering herbs along the ridge at sunrise. The elders had spoken of a rare plant that grew only in the high stone places, where the wind was strong and the soil thin. She had climbed carefully, knowing the land well. But a loose rock and a sudden slip had changed everything. Her foot caught in an old length of rope left behind by passing traders months ago. The rope tightened, twisted, and before she could steady herself, the ground was no longer beneath her. Now she hung between sky and stone. The giant horse had wandered these cliffs for years. Some said it had once belonged to a frontier rancher who tried to tame what could not be tamed. Others whispered it was born wild and had never felt the weight of a saddle. Travelers passing through the territory spoke of a massive gray stallion that watched from high places, appearing and disappearing like a spirit of the old American West. No one had ever come close enough to touch it. Until this morning. The horse's ears flicked forward. It stepped closer to the edge, hooves scraping lightly against the rock. Pebbles skittered downward and disappeared into the canyon below. The woman felt the vibration through the rope and squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, steadying herself. When she opened them, she saw the animal's head above her, framed by sky. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. The land around them was wide and silent except for the wind. In the distance, the plains rolled out in golden waves. A thin line of smoke rose from a far-off settlement. The world carried on as if nothing unusual was happening on this cliff. But up here, everything felt suspended in time. The woman had grown up with stories of animals who carried messages, of horses who chose their own paths and their own people. Her grandmother once told her that a true wild horse sees into the heart of a person before it decides whether to come near. She had smiled at those stories as a child, imagining brave riders and open prairies. Now, hanging over the edge of the world, she wondered if any of those old words were true. Her fingers were starting to ache. Blood rushed to her head, making her vision blur at the edges. She needed to act, and soon. The rope around her ankle creaked under strain. It was old, weathered by sun and rain. It would not hold forever. The thought was clear in her mind. Either it would give way, or her strength would. The horse shifted again, bringing its massive body fully to the cliff's rim. Its nostrils flared as it breathed in her scent, the sharp air, the fear she tried so hard to hide. It lowered its head further, stretching its neck toward her dangling form. From below, she could see the powerful curve of its chest and the steady stance of its legs. It would have been easy for the animal to turn away. It owed her nothing. The wild belongs to itself. That was a truth as old as the mountains. Yet it stayed. She reached one hand upward, though she knew the distance was too great. Her palm opened in silent plea. The movement cost her balance, and her body swung slightly. The rope tightened with a groan. A small stone broke loose and fell, bouncing against the cliff wall before vanishing into the void. Her breath caught. The horse reacted instantly. Its head snapped down, ears pinned forward. It let out a sharp snort that cut through the wind. Then it did something no one watching from afar would have believed. It stepped even closer. One powerful hoof pressed against the rope where it lay stretched across the rock. The fibers shifted under the weight. The woman felt the change immediately. The rope, which had been pulling her downward, now angled differently. The pressure eased just enough for her to draw a deeper breath. She stared upward in disbelief. The horse was not stepping on the rope by accident. Its hoof adjusted, careful and deliberate. It leaned its weight back slightly, testing the tension. The rope tightened against the stone instead of around her ankle. For the first time since she had fallen, the pull on her leg lessened. Hope flickered inside her. Slowly, fighting dizziness, she used her free foot to search for a foothold against the cliff face. Her fingers found a narrow crack in the rock. She dug them in, ignoring the scrape against her skin. With the rope now steadied, she tried to lift her body upward inch by inch. The horse held still. Its muscles trembled under strain, but it did not move away. The wind pushed against its side, tugging at its mane, yet it stood like a post driven into the earth. From the valley below, a hawk circled, its cry echoing faintly. The world seemed to watch. The woman managed to bend at the waist, bringing her body closer to the rock. Pain shot through her leg, but she focused on the stone in front of her. She hooked her fingers deeper into the crack and pulled. The rope creaked again, this time under new pressure. The horse shifted its weight once more, pressing down harder. Dust rose around its hoof. The rope flattened against the stone, pinned securely. The woman felt the difference. The slack gave her just enough room to twist her trapped ankle. She worked at the knot with shaking hands, her fingers clumsy from hanging so long. Above, the stallion's breathing grew heavier. Anyone who might have been riding the ridge at that moment would have frozen at the sight. A giant gray horse braced at the edge of a cliff, holding a rope in place while a woman fought for her life below. It would have seemed like something from an old frontier tale, the kind told around campfires when the stars were bright and the night was long. But there were no riders on the ridge. Only wind, stone, and two living souls bound together by chance. The knot began to loosen. Her heart pounded as she felt the rope slacken around her ankle. One more tug, she told herself, one more steady pull. She braced her shoulder against the rock and twisted hard. The rope slipped free. For a split second, she was falling. Her stomach dropped as the world flipped. But before she could scream, her hands caught the rock face. She clung to it with every ounce of strength she had left. Above her, the rope snapped upward, released from the horse's hoof. The stallion reared back slightly at the sudden movement, then steadied itself again. Now she was no longer hanging by her ankle. She was clinging to the cliff with nothing but her grip and her will. The distance to the ledge above felt impossible. The canyon below seemed to widen, waiting. The horse leaned down once more, its shadow falling over her. She looked up, chest heaving, eyes wide. The giant horse lowered its head so close she could see her own reflection in its dark eyes. For a heartbeat, everything was silent. Then it did something that would be spoken of for years in whispers and wonder. It opened its mouth and reached toward her shoulder. Whether it meant to pull her up or push her away, no one yet knew. Its breath was warm against her skin. For a second she thought the giant horse might bite down on her shoulder and drag her upward like a wolf carrying its young. Instead, its teeth caught the thick leather strap that crossed her chest, part of the small satchel she wore for gathering herbs. The strap pulled tight under its grip. The sudden lift sent a sharp ache through her body, but it also raised her just enough for her fingers to search higher along the rock. She did not dare look down. The stallion leaned back, muscles straining beneath its gray coat. Pebbles shifted under its hooves, sliding toward the edge. A low sound rumbled from its chest, not quite a neigh and not quite a growl. It felt like effort, like warning, like a living thing choosing to hold on when it could have walked away. She clawed for a better hold. Her right hand found a narrow ridge. Her left arm trembled, nearly giving out. The strap dug into her shoulder as the horse lifted again. For a moment she feared the leather would tear. If it snapped, there would be nothing between her and the open canyon. Above them, the sky was wide and blue, untouched by what was happening on the cliff. The world felt unfair in its calmness. She had always believed the land watched those who respected it. Her people had lived on these plains long before fences cut the horizon into squares. They hunted with care, gathered with gratitude, and spoke of the hills as if they were elders with memories. The cliffs were known as a place of trials. Not the kind announced by a drum or dance, but the quiet kind that tested a person when no one else was near. Her grandmother once told her that courage is not loud. It does not shout or boast, it hangs on when no one sees. It waits for help, even if help comes on 4 legs. The horse pulled again. This time she managed to hook her elbow over the edge of the rock. Pain shot through her arm, but it was solid pain, the kind that meant she still had strength left. She kicked her free leg upward, searching blindly for the top of the ledge. Her boot scraped stone, slipped, then caught. With one final effort, she pushed and rolled onto the flat rock beside the horse. For a long while she could not move. She lay on her back, chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. The wind cooled the sweat on her skin. Her ankle throbbed where the rope had held her, but she was alive. The canyon no longer waited beneath her. The stallion stepped away from the edge, releasing the strap from its teeth. It shook its head once, mane flying. Dust lifted around its hooves. Then it turned slightly as if preparing to leave. She forced herself to sit up. The animal stood only a few feet away now, close enough for her to see the faint scars along its flank, close enough to notice the old rope burns around its neck, hidden beneath its thick mane. Someone had tried to claim it once. Someone had failed. She remembered the stories told by traders passing through the territory. They spoke of a massive wild horse that roamed the high ridges. A stallion too strong for any rope, too clever for any trap. Ranch hands had chased it across open prairie and through narrow passes. It always vanished. Some called it a demon horse. Others said it was blessed. She saw neither demon nor blessing. She saw an animal that had chosen not to let her fall. Slowly, careful not to startle it, she pushed herself to her feet. Her ankle protested but held her weight. She brushed dirt from her clothing and looked at the old rope still tangled between the rocks. It hung limp now, harmless. The horse watched her. There was something steady in its gaze, not wild panic. Not fear, it felt more like study, as if it were deciding what she might do next. She raised her hand slightly, palms open. She did not reach for it. She had seen men make that mistake before. They would stretch out a hand too quickly, thinking every creature wished for touch. But this was not a ranch horse waiting for grain. This was the ridge's own guardian. The wind shifted, carrying a new sound from below, voices, faint at first, then clearer. Men calling to one another across the lower trail. The sharp clink of metal, the heavy thud of boots against stone. Her heart tightened. She knew those voices. Not by name, but by tone. Hunters, not for deer or elk, but for something rarer. For the giant gray stallion standing just feet away from her. The traders had offered coin for anyone who could capture it. Ranchers wanted its strength for breeding. Others wanted the pride of breaking what would not bend. The territory was changing. Rail lines were creeping closer, settlements were spreading. Wild things were becoming stories. The horse's ears snapped toward the sound. It stepped back, muscles tightening. Its head lifted high, nostrils flaring. It knew. She moved closer without thinking. "If you run now," she whispered, though her voice was nearly stolen by the wind, "they will follow." The words were more for herself than for the animal. She had seen men track prints across miles of dust. She had seen them lay traps in narrow passes. The cliff where they stood was high and hard to reach, but not impossible. The hunters would circle, they would climb. The stallion shifted its weight, restless. For a moment she wondered if it would leap down a narrow path she could not see, disappearing into some hidden route only it knew. But instead it looked back at her. The look unsettled her more than the height had. It was not pleading. It was not trusting. It was measuring. Below, the voices grew louder. "Tracks lead up this way?" one called out. Another voice answered, closer now. "It cannot stay on the ridge forever." A chill ran through her. She thought of her village beyond the river bend. of elders who had warned that change was coming faster than anyone could stop, of children who still believed the land would always remain as it was. She thought of the rope burns on the horse's neck. Without fully deciding, she stepped between the stallion and the narrow trail that led down from the ridge. It could have knocked her aside with a single toss of its head. It could have bolted past her without slowing. Instead it stood, watching. The sound of boots scraping stone reached the lower curve of the cliff. She could see movement now. 3 men climbing carefully, rifles slung across their backs. Their hats cast hard shadows over their faces. They had not yet seen her or the horse above. She swallowed. If they caught sight of the stallion, they would not leave empty-handed. And if they saw her standing beside it, they might not believe the truth. They might say she lured it, that she claimed it. The wind gusted hard, lifting her hair around her face. She turned slightly, shielding the horse from view as best she could. It felt foolish, standing before such a massive animal as if she could hide it with her body. But the cliff curved in a way that gave them a few seconds more. Seconds were sometimes enough. She glanced back at the stallion. "Go," she whispered again. It did not move. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, not in threat but in something closer to decision. Below, one of the men looked up, his eyes widened. "There," he shouted. The word cracked through the air like a shot. The other 2 followed his gaze. The rifles were unslung in one smooth motion. Metal caught the sunlight. The cliff, which had been a place of wind and quiet moments before, turned into a stage for something else entirely. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She stepped forward, raising one arm high. "Stop!" she called down, her voice stronger than she felt. "You will not fire!" The men hesitated, surprised to see her. One lowered his rifle slightly, another did not. "That horse belongs to no one," one of them shouted back. "Stand aside!" "Belongs." The word felt wrong on the open ridge. The stallion moved then, not backward but forward, until it stood almost shoulder to shoulder with her. Its presence was immense, steady. She could feel the heat of its body through the thin space between them. Dust swirled at their feet. The cliff edge was only steps away behind them. The narrow descent was blocked by the climbing men. There was no easy path left. The hunter with the raised rifle adjusted his aim. She did not know whether the horse would run, fight, or leap into some impossible escape. She did not know what she herself would do if the sound of a gun split the air. All she knew was that the giant gray stallion had once pressed its hoof to a rope and lowered its head to lift her from the canyon. Now the danger had shifted, and the choice was hers. The wind roared again, louder than before, whipping around the ridge as if the land itself had something to say. The hunter's finger tightened, and the stallion suddenly reared, front hooves striking the sky, its cry echoing across the canyon in a sound so fierce and unexpected that even the men on the trail faltered where they stood. The stallion's cry rolled across the canyon like thunder before a storm. The men on the trail froze, boots scraping against loose stone. The rifle that had been aimed upward wavered. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The giant horse stood tall on its hind legs, front hooves striking the air as if it meant to break the sky itself. Dust and gravel scattered from the ledge beneath its weight. When it came back down, the sound of its hooves against rock echoed hard and sharp. She felt the power of it through her bones. The hunters were close enough now that she could see their faces clearly. They were not cruel men, not in the way stories sometimes paint such figures. They looked tired, sunburned, driven. Men who had followed rumors across dry land, chasing the promise of money or pride. One of them had a scar along his jaw, another wore a faded blue bandana around his neck. The third looked younger than the others, his eyes uncertain. "That horse is worth more than any herd," the man with the scar called up. "You know that." She did know. Word had spread through trading posts and frontier towns about a giant gray stallion that could not be caught. Some said it could outrun any rider. Some said it understood human tricks before they were even set. Ranchers wanted its strength. Buyers from the east wanted its bloodline. There were whispers of railroads coming through soon, carving iron paths across the plains. Wild horses would not have room for long. The young native woman stood her ground. "Worth more to who?" she called back. The question hung in the air. The younger hunter glanced at the others but said nothing. The man with the bandana shifted his weight and looked up again at the stallion. There was a flicker of respect in his eyes, maybe even doubt. The rifle lowered another inch. Behind her, the stallion moved restlessly. She could feel its tension. It was not fear alone, it was memory. The faint rope marks along its neck told a story she did not need words to understand. It had known confinement. It had known the feel of a lead rope pulling against its will. The wind pushed harder along the ridge. The canyon carried every sound down into its depths and threw it back again. Somewhere far below, a hawk cried out. "Step aside," the scarred man said again, though his voice was less certain now. "We do not want trouble." Trouble had already arrived. She did not know why she felt tied to its fate so suddenly. Perhaps because it had pressed its hoof against that rope. Perhaps because it had chosen to stay when it could have run. Or perhaps because she understood what it meant to be hunted for something you carried inside you. The younger hunter finally spoke. "She saved it," he said quietly, though his words carried upward. "Or it saved her." The man with the scar shot him a sharp look. "It is still a horse." The stallion's ears flicked at the tone. It pawed at the ground, scraping a groove in the dust. She realized then that standing between the hunters and the horse would not be enough for long. They would climb higher. They would circle. They were patient men. Frontier life demanded patience, and there were more of them somewhere beyond sight. Camps rarely traveled light. A thought crept into her mind that unsettled her even more than the rifles. What if this was not just about one stallion? What if it was about proving something? About showing that nothing on this land could remain beyond reach? The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of smoke. She turned her head sharply. On the far side of the ridge, thin gray threads rose into the sky, not from her village. The direction was wrong. This smoke came from closer ground, likely from the hunters' camp below. She imagined horses tied in a circle, saddles stacked, ropes coiled and ready. She imagined more men waiting, expecting a signal. The stallion took a step forward. Her breath caught. The cliff edge was behind them. The hunters blocked the narrow descent. There was only one other path she knew of, a tight cut between two towering rocks on the western side of the ridge. It led down into a maze of smaller cliffs and narrow ravines. Few outsiders knew it well. Even fewer would risk riding through it. She had passed through once as a child with her uncle, who knew every fold of the land. He had told her the passage was like a test. It welcomed those who listened and turned away those who forced it. If the stallion could reach that cut, it might vanish. But reaching it meant moving across open stone within sight of the hunters. The man with the bandana began climbing again, more carefully now. The other two followed. They were spreading out, angling for better positions. The rifles remained lowered, but that could change in an instant. She stepped backward slowly, guiding the stallion with her movement rather than touch. It watched her closely. For a strange second, she felt as if they were communicating without words, not commands, not training, just awareness. "We cannot stay here," she whispered. The stallion's tail flicked. Its muscles bunched beneath its coat. Down below, one of the hunters slipped slightly on loose rock. A curse echoed upward. The younger man caught his arm and steadied him. For a brief moment, their climb faltered. It was small, but it was an opening. She turned and began moving toward the western side of the ridge, walking backward at first so she could keep the hunters in view. The stallion hesitated only a second before following. The men noticed the shift. "They are heading across?" the younger one called out. "Cut them off," the scarred man replied. Boots scraped faster now. Pebbles cascaded down the slope. Her ankle ached with every step, a reminder of how close she had come to falling. But she pushed through the pain. The stallion kept pace beside her, close enough that she could feel the ground tremble with each stride. They reached the narrow cut between the rocks just as the first hunter pulled himself onto the ledge they had just left. For a second their eyes met across the distance. There was frustration in his gaze and something else. Not hatred. More like disbelief that the story might not end the way he had planned. She slipped into the passage without looking back again. The space between the rocks was tight. Wind funneled through it in strong gusts. The ground dipped sharply before rising again. The stallion had to lower its head and step carefully, turning its powerful body sideways to fit through the narrowest point. Behind them, voices echoed louder. They went that way. Move! She knew this path was not easy. One wrong step could mean another fall. The rocks here were uneven, jagged. But she also knew the hunters would not charge blindly. They valued their own safety too much for that. Still, they would follow. As she moved deeper into the rocky maze, her thoughts raced. If the stallion escaped, would the hunters keep searching for days, weeks? Would they return with more men, more traps? Would they set snares along water sources or salt licks? And what of her own people? If the hunters grew frustrated, would they look toward the nearest village and ask questions, demand answers? The conflict was no longer just about a wild horse on a cliff. It was about control. About who decided what could roam free and what must be owned. The stallion suddenly stopped. She nearly collided with its shoulder. Ahead the path split in two narrow directions. One sloped downward steeply. The other climbed sharply before curving out of sight. She had not come this far into the maze since childhood. Memory tugged at her, uncertain. The sound of boots entered the passage behind them. The stallion lifted its head and listened. Then, without waiting, it chose the upward path. She followed. The climb was hard, her legs burning, her ankles screaming in protest. The stallion moved with surprising care for such a large animal, placing each hoof precisely. It did not rush. It did not panic. Behind them, the hunters reached the split. "They cannot be far," came the echo. She risked a glance back. The younger hunter paused at the fork, scanning the ground. He crouched, studying the faint scuff marks left by hooves. Her heart pounded harder. The stallion reached the crest of the incline and stopped again. Before them, the ridge opened into a wide plateau she had never seen before. Grass grew thinly across it, and the land sloped gently toward another drop in the distance. It was open, exposed. There was nowhere to hide. The wind swept across the plateau, flattening the grass in long waves. The stallion stepped forward onto the open ground. Behind them, the sound of the hunters climbing closer echoed off the stone. She stood at the edge of the plateau, the vast space ahead and the men behind, and felt the weight of the choice pressing down once more. The giant gray stallion lifted its head high, scanning the horizon. And somewhere beyond the far drop, a distant rumble rolled across the land, low and steady, like something much larger was moving toward them. The rumble came again, stronger this time, rolling across the plateau like distant thunder. It did not sound like a storm. The sky was still bright and open. This was heavier, deeper, steady in its rhythm. The stallion heard it too. Its ears shot forward, body going rigid as it faced the far edge of the plateau. The wind flattened the grass in waves, and for a moment everything felt caught between two forces, the hunters climbing from behind and whatever was moving across the land ahead. She stepped beside the giant horse, her chest tight from the climb. The plateau offered no cover, no trees, no tall rocks to shield them. If the hunters reached the top of the incline, they would have a clear view. Behind them, boots scraped against stone. A shadow flickered at the crest of the passage they had just climbed. "They are up there," one of the hunters shouted. Her heart slammed hard against her ribs. The stallion did not bolt. Instead, it stood tall, mane snapping in the wind, eyes fixed on the far horizon. The rumble grew louder, vibrating faintly beneath her feet. Dust lifted in a thin line at the edge of the plateau, far beyond rifle range. Then she saw it. A herd. At first it looked like a low, moving cloud rolling across the earth. Then shapes became clear. Dozens of wild horses running together in powerful rhythm, their hooves striking the ground in unison. Browns, blacks, chestnuts, and grays. They were crossing the distant stretch of land beyond the plateau's drop, moving along a natural corridor between ridges. The giant stallion let out a sharp call that carried on the wind. The herd responded, several heads lifted. The formation shifted slightly, like water adjusting around a stone. They had heard him. Behind her, the first hunter pulled himself onto the plateau. He froze at the sight. The other two followed close behind. For a second, even they forgot the chase. The wild herd moving across the open land was a sight that demanded attention. It was raw and ancient, something that belonged to the old American frontier before fences and rail lines. The man with the scar lowered his rifle completely. "That is them," he said quietly. "The whole band!" The younger hunter stared, almost in awe. "He leads them," he murmured, eyes fixed on the giant gray stallion beside her. She felt it then, the weight of what this moment meant. The stallion was not just a wandering horse. He was tied to that herd, a leader, or perhaps a guardian. Capturing him would not just remove one animal from the land. It would weaken something larger. The rumble of hooves grew louder as the herd shifted direction, angling closer to the base of the plateau. They were not climbing, but they were circling, aware of the tension above. The hunters recovered from their shock. "Now is our chance," the scarred man said, though his voice carried hesitation. "With the herd in sight, he will not run far." She stepped forward again, placing herself clearly between the men and the stallion. "You see what he is part of?" she said firmly. "If you take him, you break more than one life." The man with the bandana looked at her, then at the herd, then back at the stallion. Conflict crossed his face. Frontier men understood value, but they also understood strength. There was something about seeing the wild band together that made the hunt feel different. Still, coin and pride were heavy influences. The scarred man shook his head. "We have tracked him for weeks. Lost good horses in the chase. We do not walk away now." The wind picked up sharply, carrying dust between them. The stallion moved forward a few steps, placing himself slightly ahead of her. Not aggressively, not yet, but with clear purpose. His body blocked the line between her and the hunters, as if he now stood in her defense the way she had stood in his. The herd below shifted again, their movement growing restless. A few younger horses broke into faster strides before being drawn back into formation. The rumble intensified. The younger hunter lowered his rifle and spoke quietly to the others. "If we fire up here, we risk spooking the whole band. They will scatter into the ravines. We will not track them again." The scarred man clenched his jaw. He looked from the stallion to the herd to the open plateau. The opportunity was slipping into uncertainty. She felt the tension like a tightening rope. Her mind raced. The plateau sloped gently toward the far drop, where a steep but navigable path wound down toward the corridor the herd was using. If the stallion could reach that slope and descend safely, he could rejoin them. But the hunters stood between him and any direct movement across open ground. Unless something shifted, a gust of wind swept hard across the plateau, carrying loose dirt into the hunters' eyes. They blinked and turned their faces away briefly. It was a small distraction, but she saw the stallion tense as if waiting for a sign. She leaned close to his neck without touching him. "If you go now, you must not look back," she whispered. He snorted softly, ears flicking toward her voice. The herd below began to move faster, their rhythm changing from steady run to urgent gallop. Dust rose behind them in a thick cloud. The sound of their hooves rolled upward like a drumbeat. The younger hunter stepped sideways, trying to get a clearer angle past her. "Do not make this harder," he said, almost pleading. She met his gaze. "You do not have to do this." For a brief second, doubt flickered again across his face. The scarred man lifted his rifle, though he did not raise it fully. His voice was tight. "Move aside," the stallion reacted before she could speak. With sudden force he surged forward, not toward the hunters, but at a sharp angle across the plateau. His hooves struck the ground in powerful strides, closing the distance toward the sloping descent at the far edge. The hunters shouted in surprise, "Stop him!" But none of them fired. The herd below responded instantly to his movement. Several horses broke formation and raced closer to the base of the slope, as if forming a path or shield. Their collective motion stirred a larger cloud of dust that began to climb the sides of the plateau. She ran after the stallion, her injured ankle screaming, but she pushed through the pain. The hunters scrambled to intercept, boots slipping in loose soil as they tried to change direction. The plateau seemed suddenly smaller, every step carrying weight. The stallion reached the slope and slowed only slightly before beginning the descent. The path was steep and uneven. One wrong step could send him sliding. But he moved with careful strength, muscles working in smooth coordination. The hunters reached the edge of the slope seconds later. They could have fired then, the shot would have been clear. Instead, the scarred man hesitated. Below, the herd surged forward, their movement now directly beneath the slope. The dust cloud rose thick and swirling, blurring the line between land and sky. The thunder of hooves drowned out individual thought. The younger hunter lowered his rifle completely. "We will lose him in that," he said, almost to himself. The bandana-clad man looked down at the wild mass of horses gathering below. Something in his expression shifted from pursuit to reflection. She reached the edge of the slope, breath ragged, and looked down. The stallion was halfway down now, sure-footed, despite the steep drop. The herd had formed a loose semicircle at the base, their movement protective and alert. It looked almost like they were waiting. The wind roared again, lifting her hair and carrying the smell of dust and sweat. Behind her, the scarred man stepped forward once more. "Last chance," he muttered, though his voice no longer held certainty. The stallion reached the bottom of the slope. For one suspended moment, he stood apart from the herd, his gray coat bright against the darker colors around him. He lifted his head high and let out a call that cut through the thunder of hooves. The herd answered. They shifted closer, surrounding him, folding him back into their living wall. Up on the plateau, silence fell between the hunters. The dust cloud rose higher, beginning to obscure the scene below. She stood at the edge, heart pounding, watching as the herd began to move again, turning as one body toward the distant corridor between ridges. The stallion glanced back once, just once, his dark eyes finding her through the haze. Then the dust thickened and the thunder of hooves rolled stronger than ever as the entire wild band surged forward. Behind her, the hunters remained frozen at the top of the slope, caught between pursuit and surrender. As the dust swallowed the giant gray stallion and the herd into a storm of motion that would decide everything in the next breath. The dust rolled across the plateau like a living wall, thick and golden in the afternoon light. The thunder of hooves grew distant, then fainter, then blended into the steady hum of the open plains. For a long moment no one on the ridge moved. The young native woman stood at the edge of the slope, her chest rising and falling as she searched the shifting haze below. She could no longer see the giant gray stallion. The wild herd had swallowed him completely, folding around him in protection as they disappeared toward the distant corridor between ridges. Behind her, the three hunters remained still. The scarred man lowered his rifle fully at last. He did not sling it over his shoulder right away. He simply held it in his hands and stared into the dust as if trying to decide whether he had lost something or been spared something. The younger hunter was the first to speak. "He is gone?" he said quietly. The words carried no anger, only acceptance. The man with the blue bandana rubbed a hand over his face, leaving a streak of dust across his cheek. "We would not have caught him in that," he admitted. "Not without breaking our own necks." The scarred man finally slung the rifle over his back. He let out a slow breath, long and heavy. Maybe he was never meant to be caught. The wind eased, and the dust began to settle. The plateau looked empty again, as if nothing remarkable had happened. But the air felt different, lighter, quieter. She turned from the slope and faced the men. For a second, none of them spoke. They were no longer simply hunters and defender. They were four people who had witnessed something larger than themselves. The giant horse had not fought them in rage. He had not needed to. He had chosen his path, and the land had answered. The younger hunter looked at her, curiosity replacing tension. "Did he truly pull you up from that cliff?" She nodded once. The man with the bandana shook his head in disbelief. "A wild stallion pressing a rope to save a person. I have never heard the like. It was not just strength," she said softly. "It was choice." The scarred man studied her face as if weighing her words. "And you chose to stand in front of us." She did not look away. Yes, the silence that followed was not hostile. It was thoughtful. The frontier was changing. They all knew it. Railroads were pushing across the plains, towns were growing. Fences were rising, there was less room for mystery with each passing year. Yet, in that moment on the plateau, they had all been reminded that some things could not be measured in coin or broken by force. The scarred man gave a short nod, almost to himself. "We have lost the trail," he said finally. "No use pretending otherwise." The younger hunter let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. The man with the bandana adjusted his hat and glanced once more toward the distant ridge where the herd had vanished. "We will head back to camp," the scarred man said. "There are other herds to tend. Other work to do." He looked at her again, not with resentment but with a kind of reluctant respect. "You have courage," she answered simply. So did he. The men turned and began their descent back through the narrow passage. Their boots echoed against the rock, growing fainter as they moved away. They did not look back again. She remained alone on the plateau. The wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant pine once more. The rumble of hooves was gone, replaced by the natural quiet of the land. For the first time since she had slipped on the cliff, her body felt the full weight of what had happened. Her ankle throbbed. Her arms ached from pulling against stone. But beneath the pain was something steady and warm, gratitude. She sat down slowly near the edge of the slope and looked out over the plains. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the giant gray stallion ran with his wild herd. He was not a legend born from rumor. He was real, strong, free, and safe. She stayed there until the sun dipped lower in the sky, turning the rocks gold and then amber. Shadows stretched long across the plateau. The land seemed to exhale. When she finally rose, she moved carefully, favoring her injured ankle. She took the western path back through the rocky maze, retracing her steps with steady focus. The narrow passages no longer felt threatening. They felt familiar, like old guardians who had allowed her to pass. As she descended toward the valley, she noticed something in the dust along the edge of the path, fresh hoof prints. Large and deep, pressed firmly into the earth. They were not heading toward the herd's corridor. They curved along the ridge for a short distance before turning outward toward open land. For a moment her heart skipped. Had he returned? She followed the prints a few steps and then saw where they ended near a patch of flattened grass. The stallion had stood there briefly, overlooking the slope. Perhaps he had paused after joining the herd. Perhaps he had looked back one last time. A faint smile touched her lips. The land remembered. By the time she reached the lower valley, the sky was painted in soft evening color. Smoke from her village rose straight and calm into the air. Children's laughter drifted faintly across the grass. When she entered the circle of lodges, several elders noticed the dust on her clothing and the stiffness in her walk. Concern crossed their faces, but she raised a hand gently to reassure them. "I slipped near the cliff," she explained, settling carefully by the fire. But I was not alone. That night, under a sky filled with stars, she told them everything. She spoke of the rope, the edge of the canyon, the giant horse pressing its hoof against the line to ease the strain. She described the hunters, the plateau, the wild herd moving like thunder across the land. No one interrupted. The oldest elder nodded slowly when she finished. "The land tests us," he said. "And sometimes it shows us what still lives beyond fear." The children listened wide-eyed, imagining the giant gray stallion standing against the sky. The younger men exchanged glances, thoughtful and quiet. Word of the encounter traveled farther than she expected. The hunters, true to their word, did not return with rifles. In nearby settlements, the story shifted shape but kept its heart. A giant horse had chosen freedom over capture. A native woman had stood between rifles and wild strength. The old American frontier had shown that not every story ended with a rope and a fence. Weeks passed. The wild herd was spotted again near the distant ridges, running strong and unbroken. Traders spoke of seeing a massive gray stallion at their front, guiding them through narrow passes. No one tried to chase them. The scarred hunter returned once to the edge of the plains, not with a rifle but with a simple field glass. He watched the distant movement of horses and then turned back toward his ranch without taking a single step in pursuit. Something had shifted in him as well. As for her, she healed slowly. Her ankle regained strength. She returned to gathering herbs along the ridge, though she moved with greater care near the cliffs. Each time she climbed higher ground, she felt the memory of wind and stone and the warm breath of a horse at her shoulder. One early morning, as the sun rose pale over the plains, she stood again on the high ridge where it had all begun. The canyon below looked peaceful, almost gentle in the soft light. A distant shape appeared along the horizon. At first she thought it was a trick of light. Then the shape grew clearer. A single horse, standing apart from the herd that grazed farther back, silver gray. He did not approach the cliff. He did not come close enough to be touched. He simply stood there, strong and still, mane lifting in the wind. She did not call out. She did not need to. Across the open distance, their eyes met once more, not as rescuer and rescued, not as hunted and defender, but as two lives that had crossed at the edge of danger and chosen something better. After a long while, the giant gray stallion turned and trotted back toward his wild herd. They moved together across the plains, free beneath the wide American sky. She watched until they became part of the land again. The cliff remained. The wind still howled at times. Hunters still walked the frontier, and rail lines still crept closer. The world would continue to change. But some stories would live on. Stories of courage on a cliff. Of a giant horse found a native woman hanging upside down over a canyon and pressed its hoof against a rope instead of turning away. Of a wild herd that answered a call. Of hunters who lowered their rifles and chose to step back. In the end, it was not about ownership or capture. It was about respect. About understanding that freedom has its own strength, and that sometimes the bravest act is letting something run where it belongs. And whenever the wind raced across the ridge, carrying the distant echo of hooves, she would close her eyes and remember the day the giant gray stallion chose not to let her fall, and the day she chose not to let him be taken.